Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Off to Tube and AP World History Distance Learning. Because my other two videos this week have been fairly long, I'm going to make this one relatively short, but it has to do with your second your second supplemental assignment, the CCOT on industrialization in Latin America. And before we begin, I just want to take a moment to contextualize for you because, again, we're looking at events that have occurred in the modern era. And the theme of the modern era is obviously modernity. And we know that Europe is going to be the civilization that is going to define what a modern society is. The first definition of a modern society is one that implements Enlightenment values. And we see that coming into Europe through those Atlantic revolutions at the beginning of the modern era. The French Revolution, the Latin American revolutions, the Haitian revolutions, all are going to be inspired by European Enlightenment ideals, and all are going to be attempting to try and recreate, to flip society on its head and create systems that would allow for more equality, that would allow for more popular participation in government, that are going to essentially work better than the systems that had currently been practiced. But we know that those revolutions didn't really change as much as they said they were going to. And then that leads us to what you have been studying this week in the Industrial Revolution, because it's industrialization, the second definition of a modern society, that we see dramatically shifting the trajectory of European history, but also the trajectory of history of the world. Because industrialization is not going to only stay in Europe. While Europeans, especially England, would have loved for industrialization to remain only in their territory, industrialization is going to spread out. It's actually kind of fun to study the spread of industrialization because there's some stealing, there's some smuggling, there's some not so savory practices that led to people getting access to the new technology. But industrialization is going to spread to different places around the world, and Chapter 18 discusses some of those places. You saw industrialization spread to the United States. It is going to spread to Eastern Europe, notably Russia, and it also talks about Latin America. And Latin America is what the CCOT is going to be basically focused on, because again, or actually not again, because you haven't been in class with me, so you haven't heard this. What I want you to understand is that for the majority of this week, you've been studying the impacts that industrialization had on Europe, looking at how it impacted European environment and dramatically shifted the way that people live, because now people are living in these massive cities and there's all this factory runoff and there's incredible amounts of pollution. It changed the economic systems of Europe, obviously, as Europe transitions out of an agricultural economy now to an industrial economy, producing goods, mass producing goods to then sell on a global market. It impacts culture. You see the creation of this mass society, especially as more and more people are becoming educated in order to be able to be effective in their factory jobs. They need to be able to know how to read and write and to do basic arithmetic. That's actually the foundation of the current educational system that you find yourself in. And culturally, too, you see the development of probably one of my favorite things in the 19th century is the development of organized sports to kind of teach children this idea of hard work and competition that is supposed to fuel European progress. We saw how industrialization changes the social framework of Europe. You see the aristocracy doesn't lose wealth and privilege, but they do lose some sense of status as they are now forced to share power with other people who are not born into their class, especially because the dominant class during the 19th century and even today is going to be the middle class. And the middle class, these business owners, also doctors, lawyers, even teachers who are part of the petty bourgeoisie or the petite bourgeoisie, the small bourgeoisie. These are going to be jobs that are not manual labor, they're not farm jobs, they're not factory jobs, but they're not exactly those high business owners either. The middle class is going to be the more dominant class, and they're going to be the ones that are benefiting from all of this process of industrialization. And then you have a new class that develops, because as you see the transition out of an agricultural economy, those peasants who were traditionally doing farm work are now moving into cities, working in factories, and becoming known as the working class. As the working class, then you also see kind of the stark contrast between the haves and the have-nots, as the gap between the rich, or the people who have, and the have-nots, the poor, is going to widen because of industrialization. You see the wealthy middle class, again, getting all the benefits of industrialization, while the working class is barely making enough to survive. Their wives, their children are all working in factories and in dangerous conditions, and their living conditions are squalid at best. There is disease that is rampant in these polluted cities. And so you see a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and that leads to different ideas. Some people in the middle class and in the aristocracy believe that that was natural, that was enlightened, that's the way that the world works scientifically, and those people would follow the ideas of laissez-faire capitalism. Others, however, are going to begin to challenge and try to envision a society in which those issues can be erased, and that's where you see the development of socialism and communism. Now, these are just some of the effects that I've listed off here. But anytime you see industrialization spreading anywhere, these same effects are going to be found. So I want you to understand that when you're studying the spread of industrialization, you're thinking about, well, how do I see those same impacts in the United States, in Russia, and for this assignment, in Latin America? And then you also then want to think, well, to what extent do we see those things? Because anywhere industrialization spreads, it's not necessarily going to be the exact same, although you will see some similar impacts that occur. So, whenever you get one of these CCOT handouts, the first step is to, write your name and the date, yada, yada, yada. But the next thing you want to do is you want to break down the prompt. So what is the prompt asking us? Well, the first phrase you see here is analyze the extent, and that means you should break it down into EPECs. In this case, we're actually going to only break it down into PECs, but that's okay. But you're thinking about the different themes. Again, it helps you to take this big topic that we're about to get to and break it down into smaller chunks, so it makes it more manageable. And then anytime you see the extent, I always want you to think. You got to think somewhat or mostly, because whatever the topic is, you have to make sure that you have those qualifying words in your thesis statement, because they want to know to what degree is the topic going to be handled. So analyze the extent to which the economic system of Latin America changed. So interesting. So here we have our topic here and our place. The economic system of Latin America changed. That means we're looking at, to what extent do we see changes and continuities? Does it somewhat change but mostly stay the same? Does it mostly change but still somewhat stay the same? That's what you're going to be looking at specifically in, of course, our place, Latin America, and from the time period of 1500 to 1914. Please notice that this is the early modern era through the modern era. So we're going to essentially be looking at the systems of Latin America before they have their revolutions for independence, after they have their revolutions for independence and begin the process of at least moderate industrialization, and then in the end, as Latin America is kind of going to be, in some ways, play a small role in this imperial system that Europe is going to develop. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be finding evidence from before the revolutions, in the middle, and then in the end, and you're going to break it down into EPECs. Now, this is a nice day for Mr. Oftedal. It's a beautiful morning, and I was just feeling kind of nice. So if you scroll down, you can actually see that I've given you the evidence for the beginning, middle, and the end. So what you need to do is go through the beginning and break each of these things down into PECs. Now, some of these are going to fit into multiple categories. Some of these could work in, or some of these are going to be a little bit hard to understand. Some of these you might have to go back and look up. Most of these are found either in chapter 14, or you could also find it in the beginnings of chapter 18 as well. But I want you to just go through each of these terms and put them into the appropriate PECs boxes. So the beginning evidence goes in the beginning, the middle goes in the middle, and the end goes in the end. I'm giving you the evidence because I want you to then focus on the essay skills here. Because once you get your evidence, I want you then to think about what are two changes that occurred, and then what are two continuities that occurred. And you just write those there. Because, of course, we're using these things in order to continue to practice our essay skills, this week I want us to focus on a different skill that we haven't practiced as explicitly as we could, and that is synthesis. In your conclusion paragraph, the College Board wants you to then connect the ideas that you've been writing about in your essay to another place in the same time period, or the same place but in a different time period, or a different theme that you talked about. So you're going to be looking at, you're going to be practicing a synthesis. So for this one, I want you to write how the changes or continuities that you found in Latin America, how are they similar or different to what happened in Russia at the same time? So using the section of chapter 18 that discusses the spread of industrialization to Russia, I want you to look at these changes and continuities and say, well, did this happen in Russia? Or did this happen in Russia? Or if there's something that happened differently, then talk about that. But I want you to specifically reference one of those changes and how they relate to events that unfolded in Russia. Here's my example. And I want you to notice that my example is not just one sentence. The College Board will not give you credit if you only just put a single kind of off-the-cuff sentence. You have to fully develop what you're talking about. So here's my example. Russia also experienced the spread of socialism after it underwent industrialization. So one of those changes is going to be the spread of socialism across especially the laboring classes. That's going to be one of those changes to the economic system. People are going to start to believe in socialism and want change in the economic system. So Russia also experienced the spread of socialism after it underwent industrialization. That's how it relates. Now I need to further explain it and go into it and elaborate. So as more peasants were being sent to the factories, sometimes coerced by the government, literally the government was taking peasants from the fields and just throwing them into factories in order to industrialize from the top down. It was state-run industrialization in Russia. They too experienced all the negative effects of industrialization. Their wages were low, their living conditions were horrid, and their lives were sharply contrasted to those of the Russian monarchy and nobility. Socialism spread from the West, and outspoken leaders formed Soviets, or working-class unions, that staged protests against the factory owners and governments in individual cities of Russia, culminating in a nationwide strike in 1905. And that's going to be what's considered the first Russian Revolution, a revolution that eventually leads to the government saying, fine, 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 we will create some sort of system that will allow you to participate in the government, and we'll call it the Duma. And then, of course, a few months later, you know that Nicholas II says, well, that was a Duma idea, and then he disbands it and stops listening to it and remains to be the all-powerful monarch until we get into World War I. So that's how you do a synthesis. So for this handout, again, you're taking the evidence from down here, you're putting it into the appropriate PEX boxes. You can literally just copy and paste it in there if you want to do that. You're going to then look across the rows and figure out, okay, well, politically, what changed, what stayed the same? Economically, what changed, what stayed the same? And go down through economic, culture, and social. You're going to specify 2 changes, 2 continuities, and then I'd like you to write one synthesis comparing one of those changes or continuities to what happened in Russia during the 19th century. That's all I got for you. If you have any questions, feel free to email me and or ask me during our Zoom meetings. Oftedal out.